Good morning, all. I will start first by looking to our court reporter. Are you ready for us to go on the record?
Hi, good morning. Can I just have 1 second to write down everyone that's here?
No problem. Just let me know when you're ready.
Okay, thank you. On this screen with the name Dean Ruiz, I see we have two participants. Can you tell me who you have with you, Mr. Ruiz?
Joe Ratto,
And how do you spell that?
Ratto, last name.
Thank you. And I don't see that Nicole Mullen was present at the last meeting for which I have a transcript. Nicole, can you tell me how you are associated here?
I can chime in. Nicole Mullen is a member of our staff here at the AHO.
Thank
She
you.
is, I believe, has never spoken during during one of these proceedings.
Okay,
She's a lovely person and has a lovely voice, but she handles our exhibits and our screen sharing.
okay, great. Thank you.
And I can add also Skylar Anderson and Kyle Woldridge. They're also members, and Rebecca Stolfus are also members of the AHO team.
Okay, Kyle Woldridge, Skylar Anderson, Rebecca Stoltis.
Yes.
Okay, I have those.
I might as well note now that Mr. John Herrick is here with us also.
And how do you spell Herrick?
Herrick.
And how is he associated?
He's one of the attorneys for the STWA parties and will be participating in the examination today.
Okay.
I might ask you, Dean, to repeat a question that they asked.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, and the only other name that I don't have here on the prior transcript is Allison Mitchell.
And I can chime in for Ms. Mitchell. Ms. Mitchell represents the Bureau of Reclamation. We previously had Amy Alftenberg, and Ms. Mitchell is now here. Hi, Ms.
Okay.
Mitchell. I didn't mean to jump in.
Good
You're welcome to
morning.
introduce
No,
yourself.
thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, perfect. I think that's everybody. So we are ready to get started and you can go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you. I appreciate your thoroughness. I realize we've been together for many days, but there are a lot of us. I'll start with introductions. Good morning. It is November 7th, 2024. I am Nicole Kinsey, presiding hearing officer for the Administrative Hearings Office of the State Water Resources Control Board. This is what I believe will be the last day of hearing, at least in this phase of the hearing process, on the pending petition for assignment of state filed application 25517 and accompanying water right application 25517X01 and the pending request for release from priority of state filed applications 25513, 25514, the unassigned portion of 25517, 22235, 23780, and 23781 in favor of water right application 25517X01 of Sites Project Authority. The hearing today is being conducted on the Zoom teleconference platform and is also being broadcast live on the AHO YouTube channel. Both the audio and video of this hearing are being recorded, and we will post files of this recording in the FTP folder for this proceeding. The YouTube recording will also be available on the AHO YouTube webpage. As usual, if you are experiencing any technical difficulties today trying to communicate with us or accessing the Zoom platform, please send an email either to the site's email inbox or the AHO inbox. We are monitoring those inboxes. As needed, I don't expect we'll go all day, but as needed, we'll take breaks and go from there. Once again, we have Ms. Mullen assisting us today with slides or exhibits. And please feel free to address her directly to bring up a particular exhibit or advance the slides. In terms of where we left off, I believe we have one more witness to hear from today. We have Mr. Ratto. After we hear from Mr. Ratto, I think we are going to return to this question of the scheduling of the schedule for rebuttal and the incorporation of the ITP into this process. We had discussed a fair amount when we were together last on the 4th, but we have, I think, some issues to return to. And I did see Mr. Hitchings and Mr. Ferguson and Ms. Chester, the proposal from the authority with respect to schedule. So I would certainly want to talk about that and make sure I understand that proposal. So that is my general agenda for our morning. Hopefully it'll only be a morning. We'll see how it goes. Are there other procedural issues that we should address now? We can certainly at the end of our day today, we can circle back and see if there's anything else we need to talk about before we break for months from seeing one another on Zoom. But other than that, I will turn to Mr. Reese and Mr. Ratto if there's nothing else we should address now.
Mr.
right.
Herrick's going to actually do the exam for Mr. Ratto, so we'll change seats.
Great.
Thank you, hearing officer. This is John Herrick for South Delta Water Agency. Our witness today is Joey Ratto. Mr. Ratto has had a few health issues, and he's wearing dark glasses today because he has problems reading or seeing right now. So with the hearing officer's indulgence, rather than have him summarize something that he can't really read, I was going to ask him just a series of short questions and briefly go through what his testimony is, if that's okay.
That sounds great. And I will start by administering the oath. We'll start there, and then I will hand things over to you. So with that, good morning, Mr. Ratto. Thank you for joining us today. If you would please raise your right hand and I will administer the oath. Mr. Ratto, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Please go ahead, Mr. Herrick.
Thank you. Initially, Mr. Ratto, in this hearing, there's a court reporter taking down everything. So when anybody's asking you a question, please wait till that's done before you speak, so we're not speaking over each other, okay?
Correct.
Mr. Ratto, could you give your full name, please?
Joseph Paul Ratto.
And is South Delta exhibit number 66 a true and correct copy of your testimony?
Yes.
And did you prepare that testimony?
Yes.
Mr. Ratto, what is your occupation?
We're farmers.
And where do you farm?
On the upper division of Roberts Island, the 544 district.
And from what channel, if any, do you take your water for irrigation purposes?
Out of Middle River.
And have you had any problems diverting out of Middle River?
Yes.
And what are those problems?
Low level.
And have you noticed that there's any silt issue in Middle River?
Yes. Lot.
And does the silt affect your ability to divert?
Yes.
And how does it do that?
I don't get water to my pumps. Just don't get the flow to my pumps. And
Is that because the silt has decreased the depth of the channel?
yes.
Now that's the depth of the channel. The other factor in how much water's in the channel is the stage or the height of the water, correct?
Yes.
And what affects the height of the water?
Tides and export.
One of the exhibit attached to your testimony is a video from November 20th of 2023. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And is that video, excuse me, did you take that video?
No, I didn't.
Were you present when that video was taken?
Yes. Yes. My neighbor Mario took it.
I'll give his full name, Mario.
Mario Jacks.
And is the is what's obvious on that video does it accurately show the conditions of the river at that time?
Yes,
Now, Mr. Ratto, are there any adverse impacts to you if there's not sufficient water in the channel to divert?
yes, my crops.
Now, let's go to how does the lack of water affect your crops?
Well, for instance, my tomatoes are probably the most critical, and we're on a schedule irrigating. It affects the yield of my tomatoes, and tomatoes are very touchy with water, and you have to be on time and not too much, but enough for them. But it's very touchy.
Is one of your diversions at the location shown in that video we just discussed?
Yes.
And have you had any adverse impacts to your diversion itself from the silt problem?
Yes.
And what are those?
Well, I can't don't get enough water. The pump is it just don't get enough water to my crop. I have to shut off and turn on tides.
Have you had any damages to the pump?
The pump, yes, and the pump it ate the bottom of the pump up from pumping low water. The pump pumps a lot of sand, and it fills our cement ditches. That cement ditch right there at the bridge has been chock full of sand, and we have to dig all that out by hand. There's no machine made to dig the sand out, and we did that quite a few times because of low water, and the pump, the water's rushing to the pump, and it pumps pure 30-40% sand or silt.
Is that diversion at or near Undine Road? Is that the only diversion on Middle River that experiences problems?
No, I have 5 diversions on Middle River, and I've had issues with all of them. The one at the bridge there has been the most affected one.
Are there other people other than you that you know of that have had diversion problems on Middle River?
Yes, everybody all along that river have complained about low water and diversion. Because I've had my neighbors call me and say, "You got water?" I say, "No, we had to shut down because of no water. We closed down. We'll wait till the tide. We're going to start up." We irrigate a lot at night due to the low water.
Do you have this problem when the temporary barriers are installed also?
It's a lot better with the barriers, the rock barriers you're speaking of.
Yes.
That helps a lot.
Does it cure the problem?
No, it don't cure the problem. It doesn't cure it, but it helps.
Now, lastly, as it states in your testimony, one of the issue here is that site's water might be exported. Do you have an opinion as to whether or not additional exports will affect your current situation?
Well, sure, it'll affect my diversion, because I see right now with the tide affects me, and then when they're diverting with the export, or the big pumps are running over there, the water table goes down a lot. Now, if you put another export on that, it's going to just increase my problems.
And when you said water table, you meant water height?
Water height, not table, yes.
I think that's sufficient. Madam Hearing Officer, I appreciate you allowing me to sort of lead the witness through his testimony. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Ratto. At this point, I will look to the room and see if we have, it looks like Ms. Chester, do you have questions for Mr. Ratto?
Yes, I do have some questions.
Please, go ahead.
Mr. Ratto, my name is Michelle Chester. I'm an attorney on behalf of the Sites Project Authority, and I appreciate you being available for questioning. Can we please bring up SDWA 66?
What was the question?
She hasn't given it yet. She wants you to pull up this.
Oh.
Ms. Chester, if you could speak louder just for us, please.
Sure.
Thank you.
And in just a moment, we'll get it up here. There we go. It's on our screen too.
Great, thank you. Can we please go to PDF page 3, paragraph 2?
What is that now?
Paragraph 2. I'll repeat to him anything you're asking since he has difficulty reading anything, but go ahead, please. Thank you.
Mr. Ratto, in paragraph 2 of your written testimony, you state that you draw water from the pumps in Middle River to farm. And I just heard you say that you have 5 diversions on Middle River. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Does each pump divert water for use on multiple parcels?
Does each pump divert water for use on multiple parcels?
Yes, yes,
And in paragraph 2, you state that your diversions may be operated in conjunction with 1 or 2 other diverters, correct?
to other people.
When you operate your pumps, do some of them provide water for other people like Mario Jack?
Yeah, yes, I do. I do share some of the pumps with my neighbors. Yes, ma'am.
In paragraph 3, if we can scroll down a little bit, you say that when low water levels in Middle River occur, that you notify council for the South Delta Water Agency, correct?
Yes, yes. Do I call?
You're talking to them.
Yeah, that, yes.
And more specifically, who do you notify?
John Herrick's,
And your understanding is that Mr. Herrick notifies the Department of Water Resources, correct?
I believe so. I don't know who he reports to, but I report to him when I see issues.
So you don't know who he talks to within the Department of Water Resources?
No,
Do you know what Mr. Herrick tells the Department of Water Resources?
what he's,
Do you know what I tell them?
no,
When you notify Mr. Herrick, is it your expectation that the Department of Water Resources will respond in writing or take any particular action?
I don't know, ma'am.
In paragraph 4, if we can scroll down a little bit. Thank you. You say that you've noticed the accumulation of silt in Middle River over time, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
How long has it been since you first started noticing the accumulation of silt?
Many years, ma'am. I would be just guessing. I say 10 years, 15 years. The silt has been getting, every time we have a high flow, when the water goes down, I see more sandbars and just silting up all the time, shallower and shallower on Middle River, especially in the opening where Old River goes into Middle River. That is really bad there.
Did any of the periods of high flow result in a decrease in the accumulation of silt?
The tides, ma'am?
Did the,
Uh,
could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Let
Yeah.
me back up if I can. So since you've noticed the accumulation of silt, have there been periods of high flows in Middle River?
Have there been high flows during the time you say there's been accumulation of silt?
Yes. On the high flows, the silt builds up in there.
Is that just during the tides or is that during a wet year?
On wet years,
So,
I don't think the tides affect the silt. It's the high flow affects it on wet years.
so the period of high flows do not result in a decrease in the accumulation of silt, correct?
I didn't.
Do the high flows result in a decrease of silt?
No, No. To my knowledge, they don't, no, because it always seems like it just gets more, so.
Okay, so in your experience, higher flows don't resolve the issue of silt accumulation. There's just a higher water level for you to draw from. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
In paragraph 4 of your testimony, you state that the situation of the water levels being a function of the tides is altered by the export pumps, which when operating lower water levels in the southern delta. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
What is the basis of your conclusion that the export pumps lower water levels in the southern delta?
I hear people talk, the pumps are people complaining about low water, and they say they have, I just hear that the pumps are pumping at full bore, and that's why we got low water table or level, excuse me.
Can
And
we
the
please-
tides affected also.
Okay, thank you. Can we please scroll to see paragraph 5? That's good, thank you. In paragraph 5, you state that you still experience low water levels at times, even with the rock barriers installed. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
What do you mean by at times?
When the tide I didn't quite understand you, ma'am.
When you say at times, how frequently do you mean?
I didn't understand that correctly.
When the barrier, excuse me, she's asking when the barriers are in,
Yes.
you say in your testimony, you still have low water levels at times. She's asking you to be more clear. She's asking you to be more clear about how often, if you know.
At low, the rock barriers definitely help, but the tide affects me also. When the tide goes out, we got low water table, low. But not that I have to shut the pump off, but it is low. The tide.
So, do you still experience low water levels at times with the rock barriers installed during wet years?
Yes, ma'am.
You don't state in your testimony that you've been unable to divert your total annual water rights or claims from Middle River, do you?
Do I get to use my total?
I think she's asking you. Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yes. You do not state in your testimony that you have been unable to divert your total annual water rights or claims from Middle River, correct?
Well, I've been limited to when I can do it. If I use my total, I can't, I don't know if I did or not, to be honest with you. I don't know, ma'am. I can't, I don't know that. I know that when the river is, up and I have water, I pump, and then sometimes I don't. Now, what level of what I used, I can't answer that.
Okay. Can we please scroll to see the top of page 4? Thank you. So in paragraph 5, you state your belief that the silt has decreased the volume of water that can come in on the tides, correct?
Yes.
This is your belief even when the export pumps are not operating, correct?
That I don't know, ma'am. I don't know when they're operating and they're not. I just look at the water level and whether they're pumping or not, I can't tell you all the time. I don't know that.
The next sentence in your testimony at the top of page 4 is that when the export pumps also decrease the incoming tide, the problem is increased. So is it your understanding that the addition of the export pumps increases the problem?
Yes, I can tell you, ma'am, if they're pumping if the rock barrier wasn't in or what, and they're using those export pumps, I can tell you that the river just goes down to nothing. That's when I know those pumps are running.
But is it your belief that there are still problems with water levels even when the export pumps are not operating?
Asked and answered. He said he didn't know when the export pumps specifically are operating
Are
in
operating.
comparison to his.
I can tell you, ma'am, that on tides and with the silt that's built up in the river, I have water problems also. Not
Okay.
as bad as when the pumps are running.
Can you tell me a little bit more about how your diversions from Middle River are configured? Do you have a pipe that pulls water from the surface, or is it resting on the river bottom?
The pumps are on the bottom of the river, putting her on the bottom, not quite on the bottom, but they're down within a foot of the bottom or so.
When the water level is high enough, is that pipe submerged?
Yes, when the water table, yes.
Not table, height. Right?
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Herrick, please, can you leave that for redirect?
That's fine. Just trying to make the record clear. That's right. I won't correct him.
Mr. Ratto, how does the silt decrease the volume of water that can come in on the tides?
Well, it's like a dam. It's a dam. It's built up in the river and the water can't get over the top of it.
Thank you. In paragraph 6 of your testimony, you state that the low water levels regularly prevent your pumps from operating at full capacity, which means that you cannot irrigate as needed, correct?
Yes.
When you say regularly, do you mean on a daily basis?
I didn't understand that, ma'am.
You
The
say that the low water levels regularly prevent your pumps from operating at full capacity. What do you mean by regularly? How often?
Well, if the river gets to a certain level and the pump, we turn on our bypass that don't pump as much water because of the level.
How often do you have to turn on the bypass?
Ah, oh, ma'am, I've had to do it. Depends on the tides, how low the tides go. If we have an exceptionally low tide, in 3 or 4 days in a row, I'll do it. And 3 to 4 days in a row, or maybe once or twice a week, depends. I turn the bypass on a lot of times because sometimes we irrigate in just a small portion.
Do you divert from Middle River year round?
Mostly springtime. Not in the winter months, I don't know.
Hypothetically, if the water level was high enough, would all of the pumps that you have on Middle River operate at full capacity when you're diverting?
Yes, if the water level is correct, yes, ma'am.
Do your pumps need to operate at full capacity to meet your irrigation needs?
I'd say 80% of the time, yes.
In paragraph 6, you also state that sometimes a shared pump can only provide enough water for one party. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
And are you referring to one specific pump in that statement?
Am I what?
Are you referring to one specific pump when you say that?
No, ma'am. No, I share 1, 2, 3. 3 of the 5 I share with my neighbors.
Ms. Mullen, can we please scroll to see paragraph 7? Mr. Ratto, in paragraph 7, you state that the pump at the Undine Road Bridge over Middle River is used by you and others, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
How many others?
There's three of us that share that pump.
Can you tell me who they are?
Myself and Mario Jacks and Mario Jacks and ma'am, another fella bought a piece of property there, and I can't answer. I don't know his name, but
Okay,
he shares the pump with us also. But
thank you.
it's a foreigner, and they bought the ranch a couple of years ago, but I've never met the man. I don't know his name, but there's three of us that take off of the Middle River pump.
Do you or does your farming business own that shared pump?
My landlord owns that pump. They all own a share in the pump. All three owners of the property.
Who replaced the pump 4 years ago?
Who fixed it?
Who replaced it 4 years ago?
Oh boy. Ma'am, I can't name the company. I know Mario Jacks is the one. He handles the district there. He's the manager for the district, and he's the one that handled that. And he got a pumping people that fixed pumps, and they came and pulled it and repaired it. But he would know those questions.
Okay, and did you or your farming business contribute to the cost of replacement of that pump?
No, we did it on the off season.
Thank you. Can we please scroll down to see paragraph 8? Mr. Ratto, in paragraph 8, you state that in the high flow year of 2023, you unexpectedly experienced problems diverting water in August. Is that correct?
And I didn't understand the question.
In
In 23.
2023,
Yeah.
the high flow year,
Yes.
did you experience water level problems in August of that year?
No, I did not.
Mr. Ratto, for clarification, I'm reading a line from your testimony that says, in the high flow year of 2023, we unexpectedly experienced problems diverting water in August. Do you remember including that in your testimony?
No, ma'am, I don't. I do not.
Is it your opinion that that statement is true?
Ma'am, I can't remember what it was, to be honest with you.
Do you remember experiencing problems related to silt accumulation in 2023?
That was when the deseeded, the water went down. Yes, there was silt problems. You see it in the river on all the turns and everything with high sandbars built up. Yes.
In paragraph 8, you reference a video taken on November 20th, 2024, but you meant November 20th, 2023. Is that correct?
The videos, I witnessed the videos of Mario, when Mario took is that the video she's talking about?
She's asking you about discrepancy that says 2023 in one place and 2024 in another place. Which was the correct date?
23.
Thank you. Did Mario Jax send you the video that he took?
Well, I seen him taking it. I never witnessed the actual video, but I seen him taking it.
How did you obtain the video that he took?
that he took.
Yes.
He just took videos of the river and showed that narrow channel coming with the water to the pump there.
Mr. Ratto, that video and a link to it was submitted in this proceeding. How did you or your counsel obtain a copy of it?
I didn't get a copy of it.
She asked you, how did your counsel or you get a copy? How did your counsel or you get a copy?
From Mario.
You state that you viewed the river in that condition on that day, correct?
I did what?
You state that did you view that the river in that condition that
Yes,
day?
I viewed it. Yes, I did, ma'am.
Do you recall what time the video was taken?
No, ma'am, I don't remember.
Is it correct that the video was taken during low tide?
Yes,
Did you also see the river during low tide?
did I what?
Did you also see the river during low tide?
Yes.
In paragraph 8, you state that you were not looking to irrigate on November 20th, 2023, correct?
Yes, no, yeah, no, I wasn't irrigating, no.
And you also state that the river condition was the worst you've ever seen it. Is that correct?
When Mario took the videos, that was the worst I've seen it. I've seen it like that many times, but in 23 in November, is that was her question? In November, did I see it?
I think she's asking you to clarify your statement that was the worst you've ever seen.
That's the worst I ever seen when Mario took that. One of the worst times. I've seen it like that before, ma'am.
Would you agree that the condition of the river shown in the video is not the normal condition of the river?
No, it's not normal, no.
You did not submit any testimony regarding the cause of the condition of the river on November 20th, 2023, did you?
I don't know what the conditions, what it was, no. A tide was one, I know for sure. And anything else, low flow or whatever, I don't know, ma'am. But I know tide would affect that.
Ms. Mullen, can we please scroll to see paragraph 9? Thank you.
Don?
In paragraph 9, you state that you are informed that the sites project anticipates releasing water from the new reservoir for export at the state and federal pumps. Is that correct?
You have a statement that says you're informed that the sites project will release water that will eventually be exported from the Delta. Is that correct?
Yes,
Is that what you said?
yes, that's what yes.
And have you reviewed any of the documents or testimony submitted by the Sites Project Authority in this administrative proceeding describing the proposed sites project operations?
No, ma'am.
Who informed you about the sites projects potentially releasing water from the new reservoir?
Who informed me?
Yes.
John has informed me of what their plans are.
And is it correct that you did not review any information to confirm what you were told by Mr. Herrick?
No, yes, I did not review, no.
You also say in paragraph 9 that such additional exports will necessarily adversely impact local diversions given this current situation. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you know how much the site's operations will increase exports relative to existing exports?
No, I don't know.
Do you know when site's operations will result in additional exports?
No, ma'am.
Is it your testimony that the site's operations will necessarily adversely impact your diversions from the Middle River?
Yes, I'm sure.
And what's the basis for your conclusion?
Well, I mean, I'm looking at it going back. I mean, the tides and the export right now, I got low water levels. And if we put in more, I'll be lower yet. So that,
In paragraph 10, you state that you believe the most impacted area of Middle River is around Undine Road Bridge. Is that correct?
yes, ma'am, that's one spot, yes. That's
And-
probably the one of the worst spots, but there's a lot more spots.
And if we can scroll down to paragraph 11, please. In paragraph 11, you state that when you cannot irrigate a crop as needed, it ultimately affects profit. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Is it your testimony that you have lost profits because low water levels have prevented you from operating your pumps at full capacity?
I would say yes, yes.
And have you tracked the amount of your profit that has been affected based on low water levels in Middle River?
No, ma'am.
Since you first observed low water levels in Middle River due to silt accumulation 10 to 15 years ago, did you ever consider the cost of moving or removing the pump located at Undine Bridge?
What's that question, John? I didn't understand.
Have
that.
you considered moving the Undine Road Bridge diversion because of the problem?
No, that that would not solve the problem. Well, yeah.
Mr. Ratto, did you write your testimony that was submitted in this proceeding?
No, I give the testimony, but I did not write it.
And you gave it to your attorney, is that correct?
Mhm. Yes, ma'am.
And did you review it after your attorney wrote it?
Yes.
Thank you. I have no more questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chester, and thank you, Mr. Ratto. I will look again to the room. Mr. Soderlund, do you have questions for Mr. Ratto?
Thank you.
Asking if there's more questions.
Oh,
And-
oh, ma'am,
No,
thank
no,
you.
not from you.
Huh?
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
No problem. I'm just going around the room, Mr. Ratto, and then we'll come back to you. Ms. Mitchell, do you have any questions for Mr. Ratto?
We do not have questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Mendel Rice?
We do not. Thank you.
Thank you. Then with that, I will turn back to you, Mr. Herrick. Do you have any redirect questions for Mr. Ratto?
Just a couple real fast for clarification.
Sure.
Gerardo, in numerous times you were talking about water stage and you referred to water table. Do you mean water table in those
What?
instances, or do you mean
Level.
water height?
Level, yeah, height, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, not,
You had a question that you answered with discussing the bypass on your pump. Do you remember that?
yes.
And could you just explain what that means to the people that aren't familiar with irrigation?
Oh, a bypass is, we're irrigating tomatoes and we're running, we got ditches out there, so many ditches. And, we'll run 6 ditches today. Well, it'll take, open bypass 4 or 5 turns back in the river because I can't use all the water on it because I'm only running 5 ditches. And then sometimes we run 8 ditches in the tomatoes, and then I got to close the bypass.
So
That's
the,
a bypass. It bypasses the water. The pumping 2,000 gallons a minute, you go down to 1,500.
so the bypass is a way of decreasing the net diversion amount. Correct?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Objection, leading.
Yes, that was certainly leading to clarify the issue.
I think it was helpful. Thank you. I understand, Ms. Chester, but thank you, Mr. Herrick.
Mr. Ratto, the discussion about the bypass, that was a explanation of decreasing the amount of the diversion, correct?
Yes.
One of the things you've had is one of the things you've had to do is to shut down diversions, not just decrease the diversion.
Yes.
You were asked about when you divert generally, and you answered by saying springtime. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Do you irrigate in summer?
Yes. All summer.
Do you irrigate in fall?
Somewhat in the fall, yes. Not a lot, but yes, in the fall, yeah, we irrigate, yes.
In your question, in the question that dealt with whether or not you wrote your testimony, when you said I didn't write it, did you mean to say you didn't type it, or did you mean to say you didn't write it?
They didn't type it.
But do you affirm that the statements in your testimony are your statements?
Yes, they are.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, back to you, Ms. Chester. Do you have any follow-up questions?
Nothing further. Thank you.
Thank you. So with that, Mr. Ratto, I can thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your testimony and taking the time to be here and to testify in this proceeding. I appreciate that, and you are excused as a witness. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope I'm a little bit of a help.
Well, I
I
appreciate
do, my farm out there, we're 5 generations, and I definitely want water force for my grandsons and everything. And I hope I can do my share, because I know John and Dean here are doing us a real good job. And I
Strike that
hope
from
we
the
can
record.
solve our problems.
Thank you, Mr. Ratto, and I do very much appreciate your time spent in this proceeding. I understand that takes away from other things you might be doing, and I appreciate that you're here.
Thank you.
With that, let's talk about the schedule. I think the way, what we can start with is I will turn to the appropriate attorney from the authority to walk us through this proposed schedule, which I appreciate you thinking about and sending to me, and we can start there and then see how this conversation flows. So it looks like Mr. Hitchings, you have unmuted, so I will turn to you.
Yes, thank you, and good morning. Yeah, after hearing the comments and statements of the other council and parties, we did confer internally and with our client, and trying to balance all the considerations. What we are proposing is essentially kind of a focused additional piece of case in chief testimony that would be related to the ITPs that have been issued. And we would stagger the submittal, like a number of parties had indicated they thought that would be helpful. And so on December 13th, which was the standing date right now for all rebuttal testimony, instead that would be the deadline for sites to submit any additional direct case in chief testimony exhibits that are related to the ITPs. So it would be, essentially what we're envisioning at this point, subject to, adapting possibly, is an overview of the ITPs and then related testimony as to how the ITPs and the new terms and conditions would affect or impact the water availability analysis, impacts on fish and wildlife, etc. So then after that submittal, there would be essentially a month, and then the deadline for the protestants to file their case in chief. So this is that staggered piece of the case in chief on the ITP. protestants would file whatever testimony and exhibits they have related to the issuance of the ITPs. And on that same date, all parties, protestants as well as sites, all interested parties, would file any rebuttal that they have. And then the additional case in chief hearing days, we took off the ones that, essentially our proposal is that the next hearing day then wouldn't start until February 3rd. So right now, the current schedule has some dates from mid-January through the end. Instead, we would start on February 3rd and start with case in chief testimony related to the ITPs. And then once that's concluded, roll right into rebuttal. And then this would still be subject to the statements in the notice of hearing that if there's a showing and a need for rebuttal or additional rebuttal associated specifically with the ITP issues, then that could be considered at that time. I would say, though, that, essentially this provides an additional month. So we have between now and December 13th. So that's about 5 weeks for everyone to continue to review the ITPs and the modeling information we provided and anything else that we would provide on that front. Protestants and interested parties would have another month to review all that, as well as prepare case in chief testimony in the ITPs, and it also extends by a month the current deadline on rebuttal testimony and exhibits. So we felt that this was a way to really balance the considerations that we heard. I would note that I think it does put sites at a bit of a disadvantage in the sense that the staggered schedule certainly does not favor sites, but we understood the concerns as they were expressed, and we felt that this kind of would provide some, would address those competing concerns that we heard earlier this week. So I hope that kind of clarifies. It may have been helpful if we had done a red line, but I think the key thing is, we were suggesting that you would vacate the current hearing dates that are scheduled for January, and then we would pick up with those as they start in February.
Thank you, Mr. Hitchings. That was very helpful. My one follow-up question right now is whether you have an estimate, I guess, at least with respect to the authority, as to how many days of hearing you think would be necessary. I mean, right now this chart shows 6. I assume that wouldn't cover. I mean, we'd have to go forward from there. I assume I didn't actually compare it, but these are probably the February dates we had, and then there would need to be additional days. Do you have an estimate or a guesstimate on how many days we'd need?
I don't, just not knowing, how significant the rebuttal might be, and additional case in chief. I mean, I guess we could assume that the January dates that would otherwise be vacated under this proposal, that comprise 7 dates. So maybe we can fit another 7 into February, or we may, lapse into March a little bit. Hopefully not too far, but I don't know if we're going to need all that time, but that might be a safe assumption since that was what was assumed for the current schedule.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Hitchings. That was I made it up myself, but that was like best guesstimate. With that, I will turn to you, Mr. Bushard. Would you like to chime in on this proposal?
I do. I have one quick question. I don't know, Mr. Hitchings, if it's the same answer. Do you have a guess for the number of witnesses or times just on the ITP kind of case in chief portion?
I would expect that we would have testimony with regard to terrestrial, aquatics resources, probably an overview of the ITPs, and water availability analysis. So there might be 6 witnesses, 6 to 7. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. So first I'll start and just thank the authority, because I think this was a productive proposal, and I think the concept of it is consistent with our discussion and some of the concerns we had raised. So I appreciate their efforts to move the ball forward here. The one caveat I have is that the January 13 deadline, we have some problems with, given a lot of pre-planned travel for the holidays, when we, I don't know, didn't expect to have deadlines and things like that coming up. And, you know, that doesn't really give us a whole extra month of time and doesn't give us very much time at all from a practical standpoint after we get this authority's testimony, written testimony about these ITP issues. I think if that date was, February 14th, I think is a Friday, that this would probably be workable. And if for the rebuttal deadlines for all parties and for the ITP with evidence from any protesting parties, to do that, that also may allow us to do some testimony on those dates in January from the authority about the ITP specifically, and not have to push all of those out right into February or March after the evidence has been submitted. The two other things I will say in regard to that, one, I have to disagree with Mr. Hitchings. I don't think there's much disadvantage to the authority on the staggered approach or the timing that we are proposing. With respect to that approach, they've had a lot more information, I would guess, about the ITP coming than we have for a lot longer and what it was going to say. And then the last note I'll make is that, right, if CITES is continuing case in chief testimony about the ITP at those dates in January or some other time, we also think it would be appropriate to allow Chairman Mitchum's testimony, case in chief testimony on those same dates, since that phase of the hearing would not have closed, and don't want to foreclose that option. I saw there was an objection filed sometime this week with respect to that testimony. And if there's going to be further case in chief hearing dates, we think we can postpone resolving that issue as well. And I don't know if others on the protesting side have additional thoughts. We did our best to try to coordinate a response on the scheduling, but don't mean to speak for everybody at all.
I'll turn first to Mr. Reese and then back to you, Mr. Hitchings.
Good morning. Yes, we did try to coordinate ourselves, the protesting parties, that is. And so the SCWA parties agree with what Mr. Busher represented. And in terms of the proposal, we do appreciate CITES efforts. But when you think about the holidays, as much as we as attorneys may be willing to or have to work over those holidays, we have witnesses that we don't necessarily control. So that really is a tight schedule. So if we could move it for the January 14th to February 14th, we would be in support of the proposal.
Thank you. And then Mr. Hitchings, and then back to you, Mr. Mooney. So Mr. Hitchings, please.
Yeah, I would say that's, already we've got 9 weeks now before any further testimony exhibits would be due under our proposal. And that's asking for essentially an additional amount of time. Right now, under the schedule, rebuttal testimonies are due in 5 weeks from everybody. We're proposing to extend that another month. We were all expecting to be back in hearing on January 13th under this schedule as it sits today. So as far as commitments and other obligations, whether it was working on a smaller piece of the testimony or not, over that time frame. So I think that is an unreasonable extension of the schedule to add, and it's basically 3 months from now that the protestants would not be filing anything further on this with that additional time. So I would say that our proposal really tries to reasonably balance the interest of all the parties concerned. And we all had plans with this schedule, and this would just be changing kind of the phase or what effort we would be focused on. But we were all planning to be ready and geared up and start direct and cross on rebuttal as of January 13th.
Thank you, Mr. Hitchings. Mr. Mooney.
Thank you. I just wanted to concur with what Mr. Boucher had said, and I for one I do have travel plans up until about the 13th of 14th of January, where I'm out for 2 weeks, and being solo practitioner, already have 2 briefs due while I'm gone, so I'm already having to take some of my family vacation time to work on matters, and so to the extent we can push those dates out some, that would be very beneficial.
Thank you, Mr. Mooney. I'm trying to think about how to frame this in a way that's appropriate for this proceeding, which is to say, one of the factors in my mind here is, as you know, there's another significant proceeding in which many of you are involved, and they're scheduling for that. So one of my concerns here, frankly, is how to coordinate those 2 schedules, which is challenging. One of the questions I did have, let's see, let's pause on the schedule right now, and I want to ask a little bit more about the protestants' interests in the ITP. My understanding from our last conversation was that there is that the protestants are interested in understanding the modeling that was on which the ITP is based. And I think Mr. Hitchings, you helpfully pointed out that the modeling isn't yours, or one of the representatives from the authority isn't yours, it's CDFW's. So I wanted to explore that issue more. Maybe this is a question for the authority. Do you anticipate having witnesses who will be able to testify as to how the modeling works and how it was conducted?
Yes, I think that would be part of our overview of the ITP, and it wasn't any new modeling. The only new modeling that at least I'm aware of, and I think this is accurate, is just essentially what was described in that diversion routing tool, the DRAT, that CDFW, where they basically just took kind of other modeling pieces and that were existing, and it was another way of kind of depicting the information, for lack of a better way of saying that. Otherwise, the modeling that was done was, for the most part, conducted under the 2035 central tendency, for the purposes of the ITP. So it was all the same models that were used with regard to the application for the ITP, as well as the final EIR. The 2035 and 2070 central tendency was also used as part of the water availability analysis that Ms. Bizzoni and Mr. Walker described in their testimony. So it's not as though there are new models. It's essentially running the same models that were used, but with some different assumptions, and those can be explained. And our intent is to circulate that when it's available, circulate that before we even submit our written testimony and exhibits. And hopefully our goal is to try to get that explanation out, at the end of this week or beginning of next week.
Thank you. That's helpful. Mr. Schutz.
Yeah, I think in part there's a terminology issue here about what's a model and what's a tool or whatever. There are different terms used to describe the DRAT tool and how that relates to the tool, which was AHO 49 or AHO 45, in the previous materials that were presented. The DRAT tool, we've started digging into it, and it doesn't have all the capabilities that the AHO 49 had, for example. There were tables that one was able to produce about how much water would be available under different flow constraint requirements. There were tables, graphs that were produced by for each year, the number of days and the amounts of diversion, what the differences were with and without the project, both for flow at different points and for delta outflow. Those sort of pieces are not included in DFW's tool. And we've started looking at it, and we've talked about sort of reassembling those tools that allow us to do the analysis in a straightforward way without just having a whole big, thousands of numbers in a number table in a displayed as just a series of figures for certain dates. And so that's part of the issue. And I appreciate the fact that the authority is probably planning to explain or to add more than what we know today. But there's nonetheless, for our folks, there's some significant technical work to try to get these tools to a point where they're as user-friendly or even usable as the previous tools were. And so that's part of the time issue that we have. And we're not sure how long that's going to take, because that's kind of a critical path for us to do analysis of, for example, potentially how much water would be available to sites, potentially based on that, how much water, what the unit cost of the water would be. All those different things are things that we'll want to put into our rebuttal testimony, that not just responding to the ITP, excuse me, but to put into our rebuttal testimony to discuss the implications and upshots of that. So it's important to see those sort of technical pieces. And there's a question that we had about whether it's appropriate for us to talk to the department. And we didn't want to do anything inappropriate, to understand some of what their modeler did. We know him, and that's something that we've done typically in the past in different proceedings, but not in evidentiary ones. If the department and sites and others wanted to get together with the parties and have a question and answer session with DFW's modeler, and if the DFW was open to that, that might help with the timing. But nonetheless, as we're sitting here today, we have a bunch of technical work in front of us before we can really start to make use of and understand how the new flow constraints, which are significant, are going to affect the different parts of the project and our response to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schutz. I may have follow-up on that, but let that settle. Ms. Meserve, please.
Good morning, Hearing Officer Kinsey and everyone. I think part of what we're struggling with is we want to do rebuttal testimony that talks about the correct project. And when this process went forward without the ITP, that was kind of a risk that I think that sites kind of assumed, that risk that the parameters around which the project could divert and how it would need to be operated may change according to future permitting. And so, we've already seen, for instance, in the case in chief testimony, that protestants relied on certain information that was in the EIR, and then that has changed, right? So, this is always an issue in these hearings, that the project keeps progressing, and I think it's somewhat inevitable. But I know that when Mr. Ruiz and I met with our experts who are looking very carefully at these very issues in terms of what kinds of flows will be diverted, will be stored, will be re-released, and the timing of those flows, because that's something that the Delta interests are very interested in. That's the key issue, right? What's going to happen to water quality? and other parameters, and then as well as the fisheries issues that we've been, doing testimony on and trying to track. So that's why, I think from our perspective, we're really wanting to get, and I don't think that the ITP is self-explanatory in this regard, with respect to how it may change some of the assumptions in the materials and testimony that was put forth by the authority, or maybe even things that were, in the EIR as well that we've been relying on. So it just seems like a good time to kind of level set the facts around these. Let sites put forward, its testimony about, and it can explain, as it should as the applicant, how this changes whatever they've put forth in their case in chief testimony on these types of issues. And then, and it might be that at a different time of year, that month to have that information might be sufficient. It's just because of the issues that have been brought up before on the scheduling, and that, it just, with experts and all of us trying to run after that ball once we receive it in mid-December, at that time is just very, very difficult and prejudices protestants quite a bit. And I would say because we were asked to go forward without the ITP. So that's my concern, because we couldn't, Mr. Ruiz and I could not answer the questions that our consultants had about how this ITP affects their analysis.
Thank you, Ms. Meserve. I think I have follow-up on this, which is my understanding from our last conversation, and Mr. Hitchings can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the ITP does not change the scope of the approval that the authority is seeking. It does provide clarity as to how, at least until what I think the ITP expires 2039. Well, let me see. So the ITP, I believe, expires 2039, and Mr. Hitchings is the estimate for construction of the project 2030, completion of construction 2035. Am I remembering that correctly? In that range?
That's the current estimate.
Right. So the subject
Using a 10-year crystal ball. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So this ITP, it's a forecast of the constraints that may apply to the project, but they're not. My understanding is that the authority it would object to the State Water Board incorporating the restrictions that are in the ITP into any permit that's issued. So I think we're in this land where we're looking at
expressly.
So sorry, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but maybe just on that, because that's an important premise, I think.
Yes.
No, we've proposed a term that would expressly incorporate compliance with whatever is in the ITP, but not where every single, we don't do this with the projects, right? The CVP and the State Water Project, they have their permits that have been issued, and there's a reconsultation for long-term operations on a periodic basis. They don't go in and have to change their permit terms and conditions every time that happens, but there's an overarching term and condition that requires that the projects comply with whatever is in their CISA or Federal Endangered Species Act permits. So we think that's the more efficient way to do it. So no, we are expecting that the board is going to require, like they do with pretty much every permit, that you're required, it doesn't provide, you're required to comply with all permits, approvals, all legal and regulatory requirements. Typically there's that catch-all term. So that's what we were expecting. But yes, there's going to be all of these permits that are issued for a large infrastructure project typically have effective dates and terms, and this is one of them.
Right. I think that was my understanding, and thank you, Mr. Hitchings. That's my understanding as well, that the authority expects that the board will include a term that requires compliance with the permits issued by other agencies, including this ITP, but not that the board would import explicitly the limits in the ITP, such that, for example, I believe I quickly reviewed the hundreds of pages of the ITP, but I believe there was, for example, a cap on diversions to storage that I believe differs from that requested by the authority. And my understanding would be that the authority would not expect and would object to the board explicitly including that cap on diversion in the permit, even though it's in the ITP. And my point that I'm trying to make is I think the universe of what the board has to consider includes this project as proposed by the authority, in addition to the project that may in fact be operated subject to the ITP that we have, because that's the best information about what we expect an ITP would look like that would control operations of the project.
Right. And I guess maybe the outgrowth of that is that, so this is another piece of evidence that you can rely on in preparing your draft order, and that the board can rely on in deciding whether to adopt the order and issue a permit or not, and whether the terms and conditions in place under this allow for it to make the findings that it otherwise would make with regard to, for example, effects on fish and wildlife or water availability or whatever would be the subject of the particular finding at issue.
Thank you, Mr. Hitchings. And the reason I'm thinking this through is I'm trying to consider the I can understand the protestants' interest in, for example, as Mr. Schutz pointed out, considering how much water would actually be available for diversion under the constraints that are imposed in this ITP. And that may be relevant. I guess what I'm thinking through is why do we have to crack open the black box of what CDFW put in their ITP, rather than just on one level we can just look at, well, the conditions are the conditions. But on another level, what I'm hearing is that the protestants want to use the information in the ITP either to make their case, and possibly the authority too, to make their case, or also the protestants, I think it's possible you can tell me whether you may object to the information that's in the ITP and say these conditions are not good enough to protect fish and wildlife and other interests. So I'm just thinking this through and to think about where we're going with this. Mr. Mooney.
Yes, a couple of thoughts. First, on what you said about object, I think it might be objecting to what's in there, not in the ITP, and not going far enough. I think we're probably don't know enough yet to be in that position, but I'll let others maybe speak to that have spent more time on it than I have. But two, in terms of the idea that this is simply going to be a permit term that may expire in 2039, few years before the project, few years after the project becomes operational, and the reference to the CVP and State Water Project, a distinction here is that those projects were obtained their water rights, and probably their licenses, before the board considered some of the public trust issues, especially under the Mono Lake decision. And this goes to us. This goes to, what are also the public trust obligations, and in terms of the board, and the evidence in the ITP and the impacts of fisheries, and what type of flows are required to protect those fisheries, and the fish populations and the habitat. So I think there's a bit of a distinction there, and also it seems. This has been talking about, this also goes to water availability. And I think it's a little premature to be saying, well, these permit restrictions are only in place till 2039, and then it'll change. And I would say, with the history of water or impacts to the environment from water diversions and water projects, we haven't really seen that. We kind of continue to see a decline in fisheries populations and impacts. And so I don't want to have the impression that in 2039 all is going to be better, and there's going to be more water available to the project because whatever restrictions are placed in the ITP are going to somehow improve, and then they won't have to be dealing with those issues. One, I doubt that there's going to be any evidence to support that. And so I think the board has to look at what is the conditions today in terms of water availability and whether or not there's sufficient water for this project to go forward based upon what are the public trust obligations of the board. And I think the ITP goes to with the amount of water that is going to be available given the public trust considerations. So that's one reason why the ITP and the evidence associated with it is so critical. And again, it's, we would have liked to have had have all of this information at the beginning of the process, but we think that this requires some substantial modifications to the project and the water availability analysis. So.
Thank you, Mr. Mooney. And I don't, I think I'm following along and likely agree with several of your points. I didn't mean to, just to clarify, certainly when I said that the authority may object to certain things, I certainly didn't mean to imply that therefore those options are off the table for the State Water Board, right? The options are open. I think one of the big questions here will be if the board is to approves the project and issues a permit, which, if any, of the terms and conditions in the ITP should be explicitly transported into a permit issued by the board. So I think that may be a better articulation of what I was trying to suggest here.
Okay. Go ahead.
Mr. Mooney, go ahead if you'd like to.
I was just going to say, yeah, because we think it's it's part of the board's public trust obligations. And I think the ITP is evidence as to what some of those public trust obligations are. And so it's not just an issue of the board issuing a water right and saying, go comply with all your permits. The board issuing a water right, if the board decides to issue a water right, what are the constraints on that water right based upon public trust considerations?
Thank you, Mr. Mooney. Mr. Busher.
So I think just two quick things, and I appreciate, Ms. Kinsey, your last kind of clarification of that, because we did propose some similar styled terms and conditions as to what ended up in the ITP, and we think those should be part of the permit, or the water rights permit. I want to echo what Ms. Meserve said, and I want to try and make sure that we don't wander off into abstraction land in our rebuttal analysis here. Like, this is a question about an actual proposed infrastructure project. It will be actually operated in some way. And that's what we should be focused on, is what will the impacts from that project be, not what would the impacts be of some hypothetical diversions that may or may not ever occur, or are inconsistent with conditions that CDFW imposes or the State Water Board ultimately needs to impose or deems necessary to impose, and focus on the reality of the project and be able to offer useful rebuttal evidence that is about the actual project, not about some abstraction of that, of different water rights, different conditions than what's currently before us. And then the last thing I'll say, and just very briefly, and I apologize for being a broken record on this, we would object to any overlap with this schedule and the tunnel water rights process schedule. We've made that point in both situations. We made a lot of progress here, and we think getting this one done before the tunnel starts is the right way to address the challenge of having two giant infrastructure projects before the hearing officer, is to stagger them. And this one's a lot more ready than the Delta Conveyance project from our view, so we would object to overlapping those, but don't think that's necessary given the schedule we've proposed and the progress that we've made over the last 3 months here. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Busher. Mr. Schutz.
Yeah, just one thing. I have to object to Mr. Hitching's characterization that the biological opinions and incidental take permit for the state and federal projects are all that controls the operation of those projects. We have this thing called D1641, which implemented the water quality control plan. And my understanding is that D1641 actually changed the water rights of the state and federal projects, and we're incorporated there. So on top of, I mean, one could see from our perspective that the biological opinions in ITP for the state and federal projects filled in holes that the considerable constraints in decision 1641 imposed on the state and federal projects. Not that the entirety of the constraints of the state and federal projects is to be found in those biological opinions. And as others have said, we're going to seek to have substantial constraints put into the water rights permit. We think that's appropriate for the different reasons that Mr. Busher and Mr. Mooney have said, and probably more I could think of, but I don't need to right now. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I had a Zoom blip. I believe I heard the end of your statement, Mr. Schutz. I apologize for that. But I think we're back. And that's the awkward pause on my end was simply coming back in on Zoom. So Mr. Hitchings, please. And you are on mute here.
Sorry. Yes, I think I saw Mr. Sutherland may have had his hand up, but I would defer to him for a moment because I wanted to just kind of address everything together to be more efficient if possible. But maybe Mr. Sutherland does not have anything to say. I saw his hand earlier.
Then, I mean, all this talk about D1641 and the biological opinions with the regard to the SWP, I think, I will defer to you, Mr. Hitchings. I think as far as putting forth the obviously for the site's perspective on this, but okay, so I will say it. I think it is good to understand how all of these factors work together, and I don't know if this is the appropriate time to talk about it, but D1641 was implementing the water quality control plan. I think sites has put forward that they have a term that says the water board has that continuing jurisdiction. So there might be opportunity for the board to weigh in on that as far as what sites responsibility would be to meet a water quality control plan update. That's what D1641 was for DWR's water rights. And then obviously the biological opinions have a different standard. So it all plays in together. I just think it's important to make sure that all of that's understood. And, if, like the water board has opportunities to weigh in, look at water rights, modify them during different times. It's not just at this time, but that's for sites to make the argument. I just wanted to make it was clear because we're talking about DWR's water rights.
Thank you, Mr. Soderlund. And I will, I know I've allowed us to move off in this direction. I do want to stay focused on the schedule here. I realize I to some extent brought this up in thinking about how to set the schedule and how to deal with the ITPs, and I raised this issue of terms and conditions in the permit. But I'd like to continue the discussion, but let's stay focused on schedule, which is the operating question. I'll turn to you, Mr. Hitchings, in a second. I did want to note after this, I would like to go back to the issue of whether a conversation with CDFW would be helpful. I realize we do not have a rep from CDFW in this proceeding or in this conversation right now. So it would be nice to have one for this conversation, but I do want to talk about whether that would be a valuable, possibly a valuable exercise and what that might look like. But with that, Mr. Hitchings, do you want to follow up on what we've discussed so far?
Yeah, a couple points. And just to Mr. Schutz's point, I did not say that the BIOPS and the ITPs are the only thing. I specifically said regulatory requirements. D1641, that was a water rights proceeding for implementing responsibility to implement the plan. So in any event, that's not what I said. And in fact, I said sites would be required to comply with all applicable laws, including regulatory requirements. which would include D1641 or any water quality control plan update. With it, but I would like to stay on schedule, and I think at the outset, as we said, we tried to reasonably balance the considerations and the interests of the parties. I think by our staggering it, it gives that additional time to review the ITP. There'll be a month to review our case in chief testimony and exhibits. And so we really tried to sketch that out. And so notwithstanding providing that additional time, there's always a request for more, right? And I understand people had some schedules, but again, we were all ready to jump right back into the hearing on January 13th under the existing schedule. So what I would say is if the hearing officer, if you're inclined to look at additional extensions, it shouldn't all be one-sided. It shouldn't all go to the protestants. If they're proposing February 14th now, so now they have an additional 60 days or 60 days after we would submit our piece of the case in chief on the ITP, and then we'd all do our rebuttal also then. That should be split in some way. And I would say that if anything, maybe our piece on the ITPs is due the 20th of December, and then the submittals of case in chief on that plus all rebuttal would be due instead of the 14th, say the 24th. But I don't think it's appropriate or equitable to give all the additional time to one side on this. And I think that once again, even further balances the interests of everybody. So the point is, I don't think it should be all one-sided, that just the protestants get this additional time. And I just want to defer to my co-counsel here, Mr. Ferguson. He has a thing he wants to note.
Please.
Thanks. I just wanted to note one thing because it speaks to the potential workload that Mr. Schutz mentioned in terms of evaluating water availability. My understanding of the tool, the DRAT tool, is it's not a water availability analysis tool. And so I just want to be clear that I don't think the purpose, it has that purpose. So the notion that you might need to get into it and potentially use it to evaluate water availability is, I think, probably misguided. And I will also say too, as Andy said, is that CITES is anticipating submitting testimony on water availability as a component of this testimony that it's proposing to submit when it submits the ITP testimony. So, and CITES understands ultimately it has the burden to show and put on evidence with respect to water availability. So, considering all those pieces, I don't think there's a huge burden or a huge issue that the protestants have with needing to evaluate water availability, particularly with respect to how the ITP might relate to water availability, because much of that will be in the record with the protestants, or excuse me, with the authorities' testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Hitchings, is that a follow-up hand or a?
I can't hear you.
Is your volume? Turn your volume on.
Mr. Hitchings, did you have follow-up or was that just a residual hand?
That was a residual hand.
Thank you. So I'll look to you, Mr. Busher. Here's one of, I also have a question because this is how I had envisioned the schedule initially, which is we come back, rebuttal exhibits are due December 13th. We come back, we conduct rebuttal. And then the protestants have all the way until, by rebuttal, I mean the incorporation of the ITP, the ITP as exhibits and evidence, associated evidence from the authority. And then the protestants would have until, I don't know when, May, something like that, to put together, to analyze the ITP and to put together whatever evidence testimony you wanted to submit on rebuttal. So I'm a little confused by this desire to push it up, unless you're anticipating which I don't think is what you mean. So I thought, well, protestants will have time, we will go through this rebuttal process. You will have appropriate period of time to formulate a response, and then we would get to this in sur rebuttal. That obviously, from your perspective, it wouldn't work that way. And I wanted to get a little more clarity as to why not. And anything else you have to say, Mr. Busher?
Yeah, so let me say two quick things and then I'll try and get an answer to your question. One, in terms of the timing, I can't speak for everybody. I have no objection to sites having an extra week, right, to December 20th. And candidly, the odds that I dig into that before December 31st are pretty small, right? And so if they want to the end of the year to submit their case in chief for the ITP, I'm flexible in that regard. I don't want to sign anybody else to work up to work over the holidays, but if that's what they would prefer, I don't think you're going to get an objection from, at least from us. And number two, on the Mr. Hitchings' characterization of the inequity of the extensions, I mean, as I understand this, everybody's rebuttal testimony is going to be due at the same time. And we're proposing that that be in mid-February rather than mid-December as it currently stands, or mid-January as the sites authority had proposed earlier this week. But that extension for the rebuttal is for everybody. The only thing that happens before that revised rebuttal deadline is the case in chief evidence about the ITP from the sites authority. And I don't see that as inequitable at all. I think that's the same extension request for everybody, or extension for everybody. In terms of your question, I don't know, maybe I'm naively optimistic that if there's a staggered presentation of the ITP issues, that the need for sur rebuttal is going to be real limited, because we're going to have 6 or 8 weeks, hopefully, depending on the deadlines that get set, of time to understand sites' presentation of evidence about the ITP, whatever they think is necessary from that issue for this proceeding, and then respond to that, and present whatever evidence we think is relevant, even if they didn't address that subject on the ITP. And all the other rebuttal evidence from both sides is going to come in at that same time. And there just might not be a lot left for sur rebuttal at that point. And I would rather, try and do that rebuttal process once, as I said earlier this week. And, maybe will we have sur rebuttal? Maybe on some limited issues, right, from either side. But I think if we don't move forward with a staggered approach that kind of approximates what we've been talking about this morning, we're almost certainly going to have sur rebuttal, and maybe a lot of it. And that's a whole bunch more work in May, rather than trying to bring this proceeding to a close sooner than later. And I think that's a goal that the sites authority pretty obviously shares. And I think the best way to get close to the end of this proceeding is to finish the case in chief on the ITP from the authority, and try and do all the rebuttal issues, in mid-February, and hope that is, all of it, or at least almost all of it. I don't know if that's responsive to your question.
It absolutely is. Thank you, Mr. Busher. I appreciate that. Mr. Schutz.
Sure, and I'll try to be responsive to your question as well, but also somewhat responsive to Mr. Ferguson. Part of the issue here is terminology. And when people say water availability, that means one thing in terms of the water code and whether water is available to serve the project. That's sort of a specific issue in the water code. There's also the question of what does the proposed operation actually do to the hydrograph, and what effect does that have on public trust resources, which is a related but separate question, both of which are answered in part by some kind of tool that analyzes what the hydrograph looks like with and without sites diversions. And so those are that's part of the reason why it's important to us to look at what the actual project would be, and what the potential diversions would be under it. Because then that goes to other kinds of public interest considerations, like what's the unit cost of the water? There may be water available to serve the project from the water code perspective, but since sites hasn't chosen to proffer a unit cost, at least specifically in testimony, and we think that's an important public interest consideration. We want to do our best to kind of try to understand, based on what our understanding of what it was before, how that's going to change. And so it's not just a question of rebutting or objecting to the ITP as such. It's a question of really, as Ms. Mazur framed it, understanding what the proposed project is, at least initially, and having the tools to allow us to do that analysis. And as far as your question concerning schedule is concerned, I think it's simply, for us, it's a question of the two-step process of understanding, getting the tool to a point where we can use it, and then using that as part of our analytical process.
Thank you, Mr. Schutz. I think at this point, I'd like to turn to, I did have this question about CDFW, and maybe the answer is it's hard to know whether a conversation with CDFW would be helpful until you've seen the authority's testimony with respect to the ITP. But I will look first to, well, Mr. Hitchings, you came off mute. Do you have a thought? Would you like to jump in?
Yeah, it sounded, I may have this wrong from Mr. Schutz's statement, but that there was an intent maybe to contact, or there has been contact. I mean, Sites doesn't have an objection to any of the parties reaching out to the CDFW. They're not a party to this case, and CDFW will respond in, I assume, in whatever way they believe they're obligated to or would be helpful. I can talk to our principals as to whether there's some ability to try to facilitate a discussion on that, but I think every party is, within their rights to contact any government agency, particularly those that aren't parties to this case, and maybe some that even are, and see if they're willing to share information. So, but I can talk to our principals to just see if there's something we can do to have that question and answer discussion. We did have a fair amount of discussions with a lot of the coordinating NGO parties prior to the protest deadline, or the notice of intent. So it's not as though Sites hasn't done that in the past. We have, and we provided a lot of information as part of those discussions. So in any event, I don't think there's anything stopping the protestants right now from reaching out to CDFW, and then CDFW will respond as it sees as appropriate, I guess.
Thank you.
Could I briefly respond?
Sure, please.
Thank you for that. That was something that wasn't clear to us, and we didn't want to do anything that would be perceived as prejudicial. And just to make it clear, our at least our initial thought was specifically related to this tool, and we weren't looking for a tutorial or overview or anything like that from the department on what the ITP is, what it means, why they thought about it, any of those kinds of things. It was a more targeted technical discussion. Whether a broader discussion would be appropriate, I hadn't really thought about. But thanks to the Sites Authority for that comment, and also I agree with Mr. Hitchings. There was a lot of discussion about trying to understand at least what the project was prior to the protest period and all that, and that was something that many NGO parties appreciated.
Thank you for that. It sounds like what I'm hearing is, and I would encourage discussion with CDFW to the extent it's helpful to the protestants, and whether or not the authority would like to be involved, that's up to you. But I do think those discussions, it sounds like those discussions may be helpful to this proceeding in the sense that we will get to the issues and understanding more quickly. And so I certainly would support efforts that are occurring outside of this hearing, but that may be helpful for this proceeding. I'll look to the room. These are all of the issues that I wanted to address. I will look to the room to see if there's anything else we need to talk about in terms of procedure. My intent on schedule would be to get something out to you Tuesday or Wednesday of next week. I know you need to know what the schedule is, and we're closing in on that. But I would like to take a little time to look at this, how all of these pieces fit together, and then have an amended hearing notice out, as I said, Tuesday or Wednesday. Mr. Hitchings.
Yes, I think the only other item was just the evidentiary objections. I believe responses are due on the 15th. And then our understanding was you would decide whether you felt that there was a need for any hearing on that or oral argument, but otherwise that you would let the parties know if you needed any more information or you had questions. But for the time being, it would be done essentially on the papers unless we hear otherwise.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Hitchings. That's my intent. I think very likely the papers will be sufficient, but if anything comes up, I will, based on the responses, I will certainly let you know. But that would be my anticipation, and that those rulings would go out, particularly if we stay on calendar for December 13th as quickly as possible, so that all of you are aware what is in the case in chief. At least the case in chief portion that we finished. Mr. Busher, I saw you came off mute. Did you have something else to add?
I was just going to ask if it would be helpful in terms of setting a schedule going forward for us to respond to, and I apologize, either Mr. Hitchings or Mr. Ferguson's email on the schedule. I don't remember who sent it. With our, the proposal as we had discussed it today. If you've got notes and don't need another email, I will not be offended.
I have notes and I don't, I won't impose that burden on you. I wrote all the dates down. So I already, thank you. But I very much appreciate that. But I did note down the alternatives that we talked about today and have those here. Are there any other procedural issues? Mr. Reese, please.
Yeah, just real quickly, since we had Mr. Ratto today, there was a previous date where you requested identification of evidence that we intended to move in, and I think I included SCWA 66, but in the abundance of caution, we intend to have that accepted into evidence. I don't know if you need a subsequent writing for that or this is sufficient.
I will take this as this is sufficient.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any other matters we should address? All right, with that, once again, thank you so much for your helpful discussion. I really appreciate the professionalism and the cooperation. I realize, this is an adversarial proceeding to some extent, but I really appreciate that we are coming together and both sides are working hard to move this forward efficiently. With that, I will I think as I said, you will be seeing an amended hearing notice or a procedural ruling confirming the schedule going forward. And I believe we will be breaking, and I will not see you probably again, at least in this venue for 2024. And we will reconvene in 2025. And with that, we are adjourned for the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.